Hello, I'm Susan Krumdieck, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and you have found the Transition Engineering Podcast, where we talk about how to make the energy transition work.
Just make sure you don't touch the top of it.
Yeah. Hello. We are in Christchurch, New Zealand this week, and the topic for this week, I want to look at fiction, in fact. In engineering, we don't usually talk about fiction that much, but I have a question as to the nexus between possibly science fiction or the movies that we watch and the way that people perceive the role of engineering and the possible transitions, transition pathways. And I have with me today a special guest who is a writer and director and also a student of film and the history of film and has watched a lot of movies. I have with me Kyan Krumdieck.
Yep. Absolutely related.
Absolutely related. What are the odds? There'd be two Krumdiecks in the room.
Yeah.
And I have a question for Kyan because I've always wanted to know, what if we made a movie where the energy transition has happened and we can see what it's like, and wouldn't that help with policy and expectation and business direction? Wouldn't that help? Don't things that we see in movies influence us in some way? And Kyan says yes, to a certain extent.
Yeah, that'd be great. I definitely think that if you look at things like the Terminator, before the Terminator, I imagine that people didn't have quite the same clear idea of what it would look like if the robots took over. But then you make the Terminator, and you say the robots are taking over, and people immediately imagine the T-1000 and murdering everyone, and it's very great shorthand. But the biggest problem of that, whenever she tells me, why don't you just make a giant sci-fi epic set in a post-transitioned world, my response is that it's a very tough thing because stories, by their nature, look for extremes. There's two kind of different types of fiction. There's speculative fiction, science fiction that is, speculative fiction and space opera. And with speculative fiction, usually a writer has looked around society and gone, oh darn, there's this one thing about society that I think is really bad, and I'm going to take that and play it out to a logical extreme. So the best and oldest example is 1984. It's a great speculative fiction where George Orwell was really worried about communism and where the USSR was going, even though he was a communist himself. And so he wrote this worst case scenario of what a Stalin world could go to, yada, yada, yada. And now we have all this great shorthand of Big Brother and the power of language, yada, yada, yada. Doublespeak, yeah. So that's a great example of speculative fiction, but it's always a warning. So it's always a dystopia where something has gone terribly wrong, and it's trying to warn us about what not to do. Now, at the moment, we have Handmaid's Tale, which is a really great example for the Trump era of what happens if misogyny and fascism goes wrong.
Over the top.
Yeah.
And down the other side.
Yeah. So there's a real tendency towards, if you're going to write something in a science fiction future, you're going to be wanting to say something about the future. And usually that tends to be a warning of some kind.
Right. So you're basically saying that because storytelling is what it is, that it's almost a fundamental rule that having a rosy future doesn't make sense, because why would you set the story in the future? Then you could just set it in any time you want.
Yeah, and the story has conflict. That you don't want to watch a story where everything's fine. That the most boring setting is the Garden of Eden. And until Eve goes and eats an apple and talks to a snake, who knows how long there was there. That we don't care until she does something that takes them out of Eden, because Eden's really boring.
There's some tension.
Yeah, so utopias are snooze fests. So when we're trying to think of the way to go forward and the ideal future and a way to represent it in a way that people can imagine, it's very...
A movie would be a tough way to do it.
It would be great if we could, but it's a really hard part. And movies are not made to change the world. Movies are made to entertain and to make a profit. So when people are writing movies, they're usually thinking about what will be narratively entertaining and gripping. And at best, that ties in really well with a speculative fiction story like 1984 or something.
Okay,
so
Selfreflection. Yeah, but people say all the time, yeah, but in science fiction, that technology follows science fiction, right? That the cell phone was actually in Star Trek before anybody even thought about it.
Yeah. The sliding doors in Star Trek, no one had doors that open in front of you. They had to pull those manually. But then within a few years, there were infrared sliding doors. I don't know what it is, but I assume it's infrared.
They sense you coming and open up before you get there.
Minority Report had this vision of touch screens and hollow swiping and whatever, and that kind of inspired the age of the iPad and gesture instead of buttons and stuff like that. So we have so many examples of technologies that you can kind of throw in, but as filmmakers, you can add stuff to set design and art department that is interesting ideas for the future, but that doesn't affect the narrative that you're telling. And so it's much easier for you to have new technologies in a film that can be inspirational because it doesn't affect the story you're telling. Also, most stories of the future are not interested in energy features.
I've noticed that.
Because probably it's a bleak answer, that most sci-fis want to have crazy new technology. They want to go to new planets. They want to go at light speed, and light speed's impossible. And so once you do one big hand wave of technology, you may as well do it for all your energy sources. You want to have robots that who knows where their power sources are coming from or how they're moving quite like that. So you just kind of have lots of hand waves, and so therefore rarely are they thinking too critically about their energy systems. And they're more fantasy if you start really dissecting what's happening in their society. And most of the time, these sci-fis are interested in speculative ideas that don't really have anything to do with energy, and so they don't really care. So it's about AI. And so if you're doing a story about AI, it's not their concern to explain the energy feature.
Well, how about something like the Hunger Games, where there's a lot of technology, and I think there's resource scarcity in the Hunger Games, isn't there? That's why some people have to work in the mines and don't have a nice life, and other people have the spectacularly flamboyant lifestyle.
Probably. But I don't.
But there's an energy shortage there. There's some kind of resource shortage, but it's not energy.
Yeah. Yeah. I've tried to think of a couple examples of films that I know of that do directly address energy and climate change. And they kind of fall into three different categories. And the first and main and most common one are those speculative fictions of examples of the future where we effed it up. Where it's a warning to us of this is a vision of the future that is the most extreme example of when we did it wrong. So the most handy shorthand example that we have of this example is Mad Max. So all you need to say to people, if you've seen Mad Max, is that peak oil future, it's a Mad Max sort of future.
It's a Mad Max world. Well, I was thinking of, there was a really powerful movie back in the 80s when I was a kid, which was that same sort of thing, but we pushed the buttons. The nuclear warheads flew. Day After Tomorrow, no, that's a more recent one.
Yeah, I heard about it. I can't remember the name.
It's, it was horrible.
Yeah.
And I think it might have actually turned the tide on people's acceptance of that we just had to have the nuclear weapons because we had to, and that was the plan, because it was horrible. And then there's the one kind of recently when you were a kid that we watched that was about the Earth suddenly freezing solid. What
The Day After Tomorrow?
Day After Tomorrow.
It was a moving documentary.
It was.
It's exactly
it was
how
kind of silly, but it was like that. It was your absolutely worst case, yeah.
One of the things that I find most inspiring about film and storytelling is that it's described as the cinema screen is human history's greatest empathy machine. That you can show people's lives and people's stories on screen, and you can make a mass audience feel what it's like to be there and be them. And so the potential power of filmmaking is to make people feel what it would feel like if the nuclear bomb went off. And that can really change people, how they think and feel. Once they feel that fear and feel what that might feel like, I think it can change quite a lot. And so Mad Max is a great example of that. People now have an idea of what a possible peak oil future would look like. But there's the downside of something like Mad Max, where we now have the gift of something that people can have a mental image of what peak oil might look like. But it's also so gloriously extreme, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time, Fury Road. But it's so extreme that it's clearly a fantasy that I don't think, even in a worst case scenario, it'll be quite like that. And so when you say to people, it's kind of almost become a shorthand of a way to write people off when they're talking about peak oil, of that a Mad Max future is such an extreme that you're kind of making fun of someone for even talking about peak oil because they sound like they're a crazy person who just watched Mad Max and are now scared. And so it's both a gift so that we can get something in people's mind and communicate what that future might be like, but it's also so extreme that it's makes people be complacent in a way where they don't think it'll ever happen like that.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. You can just be written off when you want to talk about the actual risks to our food system if there was a fuel shortage. Oh, yeah, Mad Max? Yeah, not exactly, but okay. And then we can't have that conversation anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so then there's another type of movie where we got it wrong, which is Blade Runner, and my preference of Blade Runner 2049, which is much better than the original, and I don't care what you say. But it's a future where the film is largely a speculative fiction about AI, and it's mostly about that. But it's one of the few films I can think of where it's in a setting where we did absolutely nothing about climate change, about overconsumption, about rubbish, about nuclear waste. Just pretty much when you look at it, every choice that we're facing right now, we made the wrong one in the future of Blade Runner 2049. There's expanses of just rubbish, which in the book they call kipple, which is one of my favorite words.
Who wrote Blade Runner?
Philip Kedik.
Oh, okay. So it's science fiction and cultural self-examination?
So he's one of the best speculative writers.
Okay.
He wrote the book that Minority Report's based on, Total Recall.
I, Robot? Is that him too?
No.
Oh, okay. That's another guy.
Isaac Asimov.
Oops. I'm showing my ignorance of fiction.
Moving on.
Okay.
So he uses this word, kipple, Philip K. Dick does in the book, where it's this word that's just trash. Because the whole planet of Earth in the book, and mostly the movies, is just kippleized. So kipple means the sinister type of rubbish, which simply builds up without any human intervention. And eventually one day the entire world will have moved to a state of kippleization. So that's the definition of
trash the planet. Okay.
And for me, it's also kind of linked to the idea of entropy, that in the world of Blade Runner, there was a order and structure, but through people's laziness and just the entropy of the universe, everything turns to kipple. Everything crumbles, everything falls apart, and eventually kipple's just this amorphous dust or trash of human society. And so the world of Blade Runner, there's radiated expanses of where nuclear waste was just let to go crazy. There's
So
whole
they didn't
slums.
take care of it. They just parked it somewhere, and so that area is ruined. Oh,
There's
dear.
whole
Okay.
slums of where children are processing the trash to try and get any rare metals out, which is kind of what's happening now.
Right, kind of like Guyana.
Yeah, and so
Ghana. Sorry, it's Ghana where they're doing that.
And Bangladesh, I'm not sure.
Probably.
So those are two examples of where we now have great high definition images of what those possible visions look like. But both of them are in the context of where people see them as a fantasy, not as a potential reality.
Well, in Blade Runner, I haven't actually seen the new one. Do they have an energy shortage at all? Is that a problem in the...
Not that I can recall. Mostly,
So
I
they
think
just made a mess.
people have, like the wealthy people have mostly left Earth and left Earth as a trash heap.
Leaving Earth, is that one of the themes? That once we've trashed this place, we'll go somewhere else?
Well, it's a great fantasy, isn't it?
It is a good fantasy. Elysium, that's one of those too, right? The rich people go up in orbit.
So this kind of takes us to the second category of speculative fiction or sci-fi that I think has its own problems. Visions of the future where we did it right. So these aren't necessarily utopias, and there's not many of them. But the one that springs to mind is something like Star Trek. Mostly Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, because the new one's a bit darker and more of a speculative fiction. But Star Trek, as Gene Roddenberry imagined it, is a future where we got it right. That the Earth is a united force, that they're working together. There are people of all races on the ship, which was a big thing in the 60s. There's
females get to work as
female.
Well. Yes. They have to wear a short skirt.
Yeah,
they do have to. Yeah, they get positions of responsibility.
Wasn't perfect, but there's interracial kisses. There's Russians. There's Asian people, and in later seasons there's gay people. It's great. So it's a vision of how we could get the social order right, and I think it does make an effect to, in the 1960s, show people those social changes in this idealistic possible future where there is a good, positive world. And so I think Star Trek did a lot of things great in that way. But in the realm of energy, it is a space opera. It is escapist fiction. Individual episodes might go to a planet where there's a 1984 sort of thing, and we're exploring this speculative idea on a planet. But at all times, Earth and their ship is a idealized future where there aren't problems. And the thing that I worry about in the energy context is that something like Star Trek, and a lot of my favorite sci-fi, they have a ship that can just zip across the universe. They have limitless technology. They have limitless power. And it's not grounded in any sort of reality of how they've achieved it. And I think that it feeds into green technology fantasies that we have today. So all the people getting excited about space travel, it's great because it funds people to do more research on stuff. But if at their core they think that we're going to be colonizing other planets or building moon colonies or things, I think that you can only look to things like Star Trek and other space operas where at your core subliminally they have to have some sort of fantastical belief that this vision of the future is going to come to pass. And
unlimited technological progress, basically. I mean, in Star Trek, you push a button and out comes your dinner, right? Some sort of magic process happens there. Dilithium crystals shoot you across the universe, like you said. And I'm pretty sure that in Star Trek, except for the one about the whales, they haven't trashed the planet.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. The Star Trek people, the future people hadn't trashed the planet. They had to go back in time in order to get us not to kill all the whales, I believe was the story. So yes, this Star Trek future is a really nice place. And that lets us, just like you said, okay, we can discount discussions of the problems of energy supply by saying, oh, well, you're just talking Mad Max. We can also discount them by putting ourselves in these fantasy worlds where we'll be the winners, and it'll be great.
Hmm. And I guess there's also the problem of, so people point to Star Trek as an example of where, great, we got sliding doors and we got cell phones and all of these other small things that were in the series, and it wasn't about those things, but they were visions of the future that pushed technology in a particular direction, and therefore other things might be that way. And one of the problems with that is that so many of the things in a sci-fi fantasy universe are not there because they think the future is going to be that way. A lot of them are there just for contrivance and convenience of storytelling. So being able to explore the universe faster than light speed travel is, as far as I know, not a thing.
Not a thing.
And won't be a thing. But it's great, and I would love to make something with faster than light speed travel in a story, because it's a really convenient contrivance, because if we want to go between planets, we don't want people sitting there for 100 years in cryosleep. It gets very boring, and it's very sad because all your friends and family will be dead on Earth by the time you get back. So we have these zippity-doo-dah things, and so therefore, if you go looking at, well, this is a great imaginative example in a Star Trek show, and like maybe that could happen, you need to parse the difference between what is convenient storytelling, and we've just invented faster than light speed travel because otherwise it'll get in the way of our story, and we want to entertain and stuff. And so we've done a little hand wave around something, and it's not actually going to be a thing. And what's the difference between that and things that might actually be able to be things, like cell phones?
But a movie maker doesn't really want. They're not worried about us making that. Because if we buy into that we could jump between universes, then aren't we doing the thing you want us to do watching your movie?
Yeah. Our job is to make worlds that feel real and believable, not worlds that will be real. Yeah. So that's where I meet people who are huge fans of Star Trek and other space opera series like Star Wars, my favorite series, my favorite things. And a lot of them also have crossovers with loving electric vehicles, talking about how when fusion power comes, then we'll be able to do X. When X technology happens, we'll be able to do Y.
Well, we do get into space with hydrogen.
Right.
We already use hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. So that's where I would just caution anyone who looks to science fiction like Star Trek for inspiration of what the future might look like based solely on story contrivance.
No, but it feels good. It's a good escapism.
And that's why we make Star Trek, is because
that's why I do it.
It is escapist fiction. That's what space opera is. Like Lord of the Rings and fantasy is escapist. You want to go to this new lush world and live in that world and experience it. But at no point do we think that Middle Earth is going to be a physically real place.
Well, that's true.
So then what do we have?
Well, I asked you to think really hard, since you know so many movies where they actually did that, where the future, they've made the energy transition.
Yeah, and I say, and you always say, like, why don't you write a great thing where they've transitioned? And
I'll help you design that future that you set the show in,
and just tell a story in a utopia where no one has problems and they've all sorted everything out. I didn't say utopia.
I just said where the energy transition is done.
Yeah. And I say, that sounds like it's really boring because they've got it right. There's no story there. What is the speculative hook of what we're doing wrong that we're projecting into the future?
And I said, set a love story there or something.
Great. And so that's where the only film I can think of off the top of my head is one of my favorite films of all time. A bit of a theme here. Her. It's from 2013 with Joaquin Phoenix, Spike Jonze, Scarlett Johansson. It's a indie love story between Joaquin Phoenix and his computer.
His phone.
It's even an earpiece just in his ear, and with Scarlett Johansson's voice. And who couldn't fall in love with Scarlett Johansson's voice? And the whole film is just about their relationship, and it is a speculative fiction, sort of about AI, but it's not AI taking over.
But the tension is because she's not real. Yeah?
Yeah.
Because I kept expecting, okay, but she's going to turn out to be real, right? And so to a certain extent, that was a foible of technology making it too real. Or am I reading too much into it?
One of the things I love about her is that I don't think it's as specifically about one speculative thing. I think it's first and foremost a relationship drama that stabs you in the heart, and like you connect with characters, and it's about a man in a relationship that's atypical and that most people don't understand, and it's about that drama and the relationship, and then it's kind of about technology and AI, and so because it's about those things first, and the stakes of the story and the conflict are all relationship issues, and because it's about AI, it has to be set in the future. But the problem about the story is not the setting and not that it is in the future. And so what the film is just kind of vaguely set in this vague future where it's not a dystopia. It's just kind of a nice place. But it's not overtly different to now. He has a pretty great life. He lives in a pretty apartment. Everything's
crazy computer games, didn't he?
Yeah. Holographic things. It looks like a lot of fun. Everything's kind of pastel and interior designed pretty. He has friends. Everything's clean.
There's no trash building up. It's not kippled.
He walks to work. He walks to a train station and then takes the train to work. He can still go to the beach and have a great day in the sunny beach and go to open air markets. And he can go to the mountains for a weekend away. It's just kind of a lovely life, but it's set in LA in the future. And not once, when you think about it, was there a car. Not once did he, use...
He didn't have to cross the street and fight traffic, or... I never actually noticed that at all.
Yeah.
That didn't... Yeah.
The first time I watched it...
The setting wasn't a thing.
I thought it was set in New York, just because of the way that he used transport. It didn't occur to me till later, they don't have beaches like that in New York. Oh, it's quite sunny. That's not the New York skyline at all. And only upon further viewings did I realize, that's LA.
LA has built itself a train system. Huh?
I at first almost had a guttural, knee-jerk reaction of that's not LA. You've gotten LA wrong. What
were you thinking?
It's a horrifying hellscape of unending suburbia and highways. And the passive representation of a transitioned LA from a highway monstrosity to the utopia of a New York-like existence, which it's almost the same science fiction as the space travel, though, because right now, if you think about it, any show that's set in LA, they have to magically skip through the bits where people took 4 hours to drive across the city. Yep.
You always have to write that in somehow, and then, boom, there they are on the other side of the city. Because honest to God, it takes an hour to go 4 kilometers in Los Angeles.
Yep.
And so he lives in this utopia where technology has transcended itself. And taken him out of that world where he's just in this quagmire of this car-infested world, and now he's free. He can move about as he likes. It's kind of interesting.
So as far as helpful, positive, transition-engineered stories, to me, the story can never be about how we transitioned, or at least the conflict of the story can never be about the setting, because that'll always push it towards a dystopia. It'll always push it towards what we did wrong. it kind of just needs to be a element of the environment around them that we have transitioned, and look how easy it is, and we don't even really think about it. And the plot's not even really about this, but just look around us and our life seems fine.
Do you think that that's one of the things people actually really enjoyed about her? Was that there was something about it that they maybe didn't even recognize about the world where it is, that was this other kind of world?
Maybe. I think it's a great film about like
relationships,
romance and
characters,
heart.
Yeah.
But so so I guess that's in conclusion, my working theory on how fiction and narrative can, if we can take that power of fiction to translate the ideas of how we can change onto screen so people have a mental image of it, but somehow not make it so fantastical, not the conflict at the heart of the story, that might be able to give us a vision of what a transitioned future looks like. If Star Trek had that as the subtext of its setting, it could almost be the perfect show. But then they wouldn't be really trekking around stars. Really.
No, probably not.
So
it would be Red Dwarf.
Yep.
It would be a comedy world.
Another great documentary, Red Dwarf.
That's right, Red Dwarf. All right, so Kyan has explained to us basically why we should not expect help from Hollywood in the energy transition, and why we really can't, and why we shouldn't be surprised that all of the movies, the books, the stories that we have about the future are not the best place to go. That's just the way things are. So we're not, possibly we're not doomed, but for good storytelling, we're not going to find energy transition in a popular television show or movie. Not very likely.
Not very likely.
But if you haven't seen her,
look in the background.
It's on Netflix.
You might be able to see
it
in things like
her. I'm gonna have to watch it again. I just never actually noticed that.
The only other place where I think that it might be possible would be something like a TV show where the setting doesn't have to be the conflict. Maybe possibly in some place you could have a show just set in a vague future like her, and you might be able to explore in small ways the differences about how we live now versus how they live.
Right. But it still doesn't really help us in communicating the energy transition and transition engineering work that we're trying to do, does it?
No.
Well, thank you for joining me, though, and having a chat about it. That's been helpful.
And good luck, and I hope you save the world while I go have fun with movies.
Oh, dear me. Thank you. Bye. This is the part of the podcast where I try to convince you to take action. By action, I mean I want you to go to the Transition Engineering website and have a look around. The Global Association for Transition Engineering has been launched, and we have a professional group you can look into joining. But for right now, I would really appreciate it if you would go to www.transitionengineering.org and just have a look at what we've got there, what we think transition engineering means, and what this group of people are trying to do. I think you will find it really interesting. There are things to learn there. There are people to meet and things to do. And I hope to see you again soon.